Hello there, good evening and welcome. This is The Lost and Forgotten on TV1, where we talk about several communities and their glorious past in Ceylon. Today's topic of discussion will focus on the Turks who arrived in the country and established a community of themselves. Joining us in the studios as always is Dr. Zameer Careem from the University of Colombo. Good evening to you, Zameer. Welcome to the show.
Very good evening, Hassen.
Zameer, as always, let's start off by talking about the origins of the Turks. When did the Turks start arriving in the country?
The history of the Turks in Sri Lanka can be traced back to as early as the 9th century. So the very first Turk who came to the country was a royal prince, and he came to Ceylon in 880, somewhere during that period. And then since the 9th century, there have been many Turks who have settled in different parts of the island. So talking about their antecedents, there were many merchants, there were many traders who came to Ceylon during the Portuguese colonial period, even prior to the colonial era. And during the Dutch colonial period, there were soldiers, there were mercenaries, there were traders who came to Ceylon. And during the British colonial period, there were many Turks who came and settled, not just from Turkey, but also from other countries that belonged to the Ottoman Empire, right? So from the Ottoman Empire as well as from parts of India, there were Turks who came to Sri Lanka, or those who were of Turkish origin, came and settled in different parts of our island during the British colonial period, right? And we even had two consulate officers in our country representing the Turkish government in Ceylon. There was one in Gaul and there was one in Colombo. So we had a significant population of Turks who lived in Ceylon during the colonial period, and even now we have people who are of Turkish descent still living in our country.
How was life like for the Turks in the pre-colonial times? You said that they existed throughout the colonial period, but they existed before that as well. How was life like for them?
Okay, so talking about their earliest advent, the very first Turk who came to this country was a royal prince. So his name was Jamaldeen, right? So a royal prince called Jamaldeen hailed from this place called Konya, which is in Asia Minor, which is eastern Turkey. From a place called Konya, he was the son of a sultan. He was a royal prince who came to our country somewhere in 880 during that period. He was in fact not just a royal prince, but he was also a physician. So he was a physician who came to this country. There is not much information concerning how many people came with him. He must have had a retinue of servants as well as his companions who would have arrived in the country. His entourage as well. This was in the 9th century. So he was the son of the sultan called Alauddin. Some records mention as various variants of the names are available. So he is said to have hailed from this place called Konya, which is in Asia Minor. And he lived in Beruwala. Right, so he came to Ceylon, he settled in Beruwala, right? So Beruwala was this place which was formerly identified as Berberin. Beruwala was formerly called Berberin. So some legends say that it was called Berberin because the Berbers had in fact settled in the region. So Berbers are those who hailed from northern African countries like Morocco, from Algeria, Tunisia, from Libya and those places. But as far as the research goes, as far as archaeological evidences and historic evidences, there is not much evidence to prove that there were Berbers who settled. But this prince is said to have arrived from present-day Turkey and lived in what is now Beruwala, which was formerly called Berberin.
Was there a reason for his visit to the country?
He was a physician. Because back then there were many explorers and members of the royal family. They in fact had the finances to go around the world and explore places. And I presume that he was also interested in discovering places, and he came to Ceylon. This was in 9th century. This has been recorded by various historians of our country. Shukri has in fact spoken about it. Likewise, an article which is based on Maldives' conversion to Islam, written by Hassaan, Ahmed, Maniker, and he has in fact spoken about this particular prince Jamaldeen who came to Ceylon in the 9th century. Muller in the book Children of Lion, even in that particular book he has mentioned about this Turkish prince who settled in our country in the 9th century. So since 9th century there is not much evidence on whether his descendants or whether he married locally or did he form a family, and much information isn't available. Whom did he get married to? But there are people who now belong to the Ceylonese Muslim community who claim Turkish lineage, right? Those who live in Beruwala, because Beruwala or Berberin as it was called formerly, even if you read Portuguese chronicles like De Cura's chronicles and various other chronicles starting from the Portuguese period, this place Beruwala was famed for its like they had hospitals back then, Ayurvedic hospitals, as well as for Unani. So Unani is the Greco-Arabic medicine. So some historians surmise with tolerable authority that this Jalaluddin, the prince who came from Turkey could have introduced Unani medicine to the country. And even prior to that, there were Yemeni traders who had settled in the region. There aren't ample evidences to prove that there were Berbers. In my opinion, there were no Berbers who came from northern African countries, but there were Yemeni traders as well as traders from Baghdad and various other countries who settled, and there were Turks who came from time to time, and mainly traders who came to our country, and they settled in Beirut, which was famed for its hospitals and stuff. People used to surge in from all quarters of the globe, even from Southeast Asia and from the Indian subcontinent. There were people who came for their treatment to Ceylon. So this was during the 9th, 10th centuries. And then later, even during the Portuguese colonial period, there were many Turks who came to the country. So there is this record of a Turkish warlord, okay, called Lufti. So there was this Turkish warlord who had in fact waged and conquered this territory called Sumatra, which is in present-day Indonesia. So he waged war against the Portuguese and conquered Sumatra, and his capital was Aceh. And then because the Turkish warlord Lufti was in Sumatra, there were delegations sent from Ceylon, from Malabar, from Coromandel Coast, from Cape Cameron, as well as from Maldives and various other places like Gujarat and various other places. There were delegates sent to meet Lufti, to seek his assistance and all those. And this has also been mentioned in various books that have been authored, like Pearson, for example, and Casale, and various other authors have in fact given details about the settlement as well as delegates being sent from Ceylon. And there were even Ottoman mosques in the country. So there are so many authors who have gone into detail and described about it, right? So according to Roen, he has mentioned that there were Ottoman mosques in Ceylon. So we do not know whether these Ottoman mosques, there is a record saying that it was in fact the Turks who financed the construction of these mosques. Where are these mosques located? We are not really sure. Right. But there were Ottoman mosques in our country, and this was during 1564. That was when the delegation was sent from Ceylon to Sumatra to meet the Turkish warlord. I'm not sure whether you have heard of this Ottoman Empire. There was this very famous Ottoman Empire, extremely powerful, and this was throughout, starting from the 13th century all the way up until the early 20th century. The Ottoman controlled vast territories, right? Whether it be in the Mediterranean, in the Middle East, as well as in North Africa. So this started in 1299. So the very first Sultan who established this Ottoman Empire, it is said that he had a dream of a tree sprouting from his body, and this tree was a magnificent tree with branches that spread across the world. And that is the reason why he wanted to establish an empire. And the name of this Sultan is Ottoman, or Osman as he was called. And then it was anglicized as Ottoman. Right. So Osman became Ottoman, okay, so it's an Arabic name. So because the Sultan of Turkey was considered as the Islamic Caliph, as the leader of the Islamic world. So because he was the leader of the Islamic world, and also because he had conquered various territories, and even up until 1920s, there was no country called Saudi Arabia. There was no Saudi Arabia, so the whole Hijaz area of present-day Saudi Arabia, encompassing some of the most important cities for the Muslims, the holiest cities such as Mecca, Medina, and even Jeddah and various other entrepôts, were under the control of the Ottomans, right? So Ottomans in the sense the Turks. So in fact, we maintain strong trade links with all these cities, with Jeddah and various other entrepôts in North Africa, whether it be in Egypt, Algeria, because Egypt, even starting from the 16th century up until the mid-19th century, was under the rule of the Ottomans. Likewise, various other countries, be Libya and all those places. So we did send delegates to those countries, emissaries were sent, we established strong trade ties. And because the Muslims of our nation had to in fact go to Mecca and Medina for the pilgrimage, for the Hajj pilgrimage. So if you are to go to Mecca and Medina, obviously you have to go to this area which was then under the control of the Ottomans. So there were Turkish consuls, Turkish delegates who had come to Ceylon and settled, or they were here for some time. There were Turkish explorers who came to our nation. Likewise, there were Muslims. The Muslims of Ceylon maintained strong ties with the Turks. And there is this Sir Edward Creasy, who was the Chief Justice of Ceylon, and he writes that even during the British colonial period, this was in 19th century, that the Ceylonese maintained strong ties with the Turks, with the Ottomans, and when they had issues with regard to the law or in something with regard to the Islamic rites and rituals, to do with liturgy, to do with the lawfulness, anything to do with the Islamic customs or Islamic rules or whatever, they had to send a delegation to meet the Ottoman Sultan or a chieftain in Hijaz area or to Constantinople so that they could resolve a problem or anything serious, a serious decision that had to be made concerning the Muslim community of our country. We always used to send our envoys to Turkey, in the sense the Ottoman Empire. So we used to send them to meet the Ottoman leaders, the chieftains, and then they used to send their envoys to our country. So this happened starting from the Portuguese colonial period all the way up until the British colonial era. This continued. And again during the Portuguese colonial era, like when you read this Tamil narrative called Matatakkalappu Manmiyam, which basically means the glory of Batticaloa, and even if you read the accounts by Professor McGilvray, so Dennis McGilvray, he writes, and there is a bit of a confusion whether it was in fact the Pathans, the Afghans who came to the country during the Portuguese colonial period, this was in the 16th century, or was it the Turks who came? Because some records say it was the Turks who came to the country, some records say it was the Afghans. I'll be telling you the story right now. So what happened in 16th century was there was this trade of Indian madder and all that, spices. We used to export various commodities to India. Likewise from India we used to import various things, and it is even mentioned in John Ribeiro, who was a Portuguese captain, that we used to import Turkish carpets. Turkish carpets from India, that's what the record says.
Right.
Okay, so Turkish carpets from India, because even India was ruled by the Turks. There were many Turkish empires, Turkish sultanates that were established in India as well. So when you talk about Delhi, Bengal, Carnatic, Deccan Plateau, and all those areas, there were various Turkish sultanates that were established starting from the 13th century all the way up until the 17th, 18th centuries. There were many Turkish sultanates. So because of that particular reason, we did import Turkish carpets and various other goods that were manufactured originally in Turkey or manufactured by the Turks who had settled in India. So in 16th century, there is a story that a schooner carrying Turks, some records say Afghans, some records say Turks. The schooner carrying Turks came to, they were en route to Maldives probably, and it was caught in a storm. So battered by relentless gales, this particular schooner was washed ashore and they sought refuge on the eastern coast of our country.
How
right?
many people were there?
There is no record on how many people came, but there is only records of this. We're still not sure whether it was the Afghans because they identified as Pathans, or whether the Turks. So I presume that they came probably from India because India already had a significant population of Afghans as well as Turks. So they were probably en route to Maldives, and then their schooner was caught in the storm, and then they were washed ashore. And they sought refuge and they were provided asylum by the Mukwars. So these Turks are believed to have resolved the feud, a long-standing feud between the two fishing communities that live on the eastern coast of our country, the Timilars as well as the Mukwars. So there was this long-standing feud, and they helped resolve this feud. There were several battles that were fought. They in fact helped the Mukwars because it is the Mukwars who provided refuge, whether it be to the Afghans or to the Turks, right? So because of that particular reason, there were many battles that were fought. They protected the Mukwar villagers, Eravur, Akarepat, all those areas from the incursions, from the forays from the north, from the Timilar villages as well. Likewise, there are many place names in Batticaloa region that are named after the battles that were fought back then. Mandar Mule means a place where the Turks came and rested. Sattar Kundan is a place where the Timilar chieftain Sattaru was in fact assassinated in this particular place. Vahe Tukiapalai. Vahe was the name of this Timilar chiefess. This queen is said to have been executed in this area. So there were many place names named in honor of the Turks who settled. So it's still a confusion if you read the accounts by Dennis McGilvray, the professor. Likewise, when you read the account of Nadarajas, that is Matatakkalappu Manmiyam, the Glory of Batticaloa, there are accounts about the Turks who had settled in Ceylon during the Portuguese colonial period, right? And there is also a record which has been mentioned by Reid that when these Ottomans were controlling different parts of the world, there was a time that even the Muslims in our country were apparently harassed by the Portuguese because proselytizing was very common back then. So even the Muslims who were living on the, the southern coast of our country, the coastal provinces, the maritime provinces, which came under the rule of the Portuguese were expecting the Muslims to convert as well. So when this happened, when the Muslims were being subjected to torture, what they did was they in fact sent envoys to the Ottoman Empire seeking the assistance from the Ottomans. And it is said that the Ottomans even sent troops to crush the Kafirs in our country. So I'm not sure whether Kafir in the sense, are they referring to the African mercenaries? It's a derogatory term to identify those of African descent, or does the record refer to the fact that it was the non-Muslims, because non-Muslims in Arabic are identified as Kafir, a non-believer. So we're not sure whether are they referring to the soldiers, the African soldiers employed by the Portuguese, or are they referring to the Portuguese soldiers themselves. But anyways, there were troops who were sent from Ottoman Empire to fight the Portuguese in the country, as well as to protect the Muslims in our nation. So this was all during the Portuguese colonial era.
Right. Talk me through the lifestyle of the Turks in Ceylon, let's say during the period of the Dutch and the British as well. Was it just confined to fighting battles on behalf of the people?
Okay, so talking about the Dutch colonial period, the very first Dutch envoy who came to Ceylon, I spoke about him during the episode on the Dutch burgers as well, was Joris van Spilbergen. So he was a Dutch naval admiral who came to Ceylon. So when he came to the country with his entourage and with his emissaries, when he came to the nation, he met King Wilmerdamsuri of Kandy, and it is mentioned in his travelogues, in his itinerary, that when he went to meet the king in Kandy, the Kandian king Wilmerdamsuri had people from all belonging to all races living in Kandy. So Kandy has been described as a very cosmopolitan city. Even if you read the account by Rajpal Kumar de Silva or Arnold Wright's 20th century impressions of Ceylon, it's been mentioned that during the reign of Wilmerdamsuri, who was a secular monarch, Kandy was a very cosmopolitan area, and people belonging to different races and ethnic groups lived in Kandy during the 17th century, early 17th century. This was in 1602 August. So this was when Joris van Spilbergen came to Ceylon. He describes how the king was escorted and his golden gilded palanquin and all those things. And he talks about the Turks. So the king is said to have had like 1,000 odd soldiers, and the Turks were also soldiers during the reign of Wilmerdamsuri. So there were Turkish soldiers, Turkish mercenaries who had lived in Kandy during the Dutch colonial period, as evidenced by the writings of Joris van Spilbergen. So there were Turks, there were Moors, there were Kafirs, again a pejorative term to identify the Africans, then renegade Portuguese. Likewise, there were many other communities, including Brahmins, who were living in Kandy during the Dutch colonial era. And then during the Dutch period as well, there were many traders who came to Ceylon. As I mentioned, because India had already established, there were many Turkish empires, sultanates in India. Because of this particular reason, there were many people from India, including Turks, who came to Ceylon for trade purposes. So there were merchants, there were traders, who settled in different parts of our island. And then when the British usurped the Dutch and took control over the maritime provinces of our nation, this was in 1795, 1796, and this advent of the Turks continued. Right? So Turks started arriving from different parts of India as well as from Turkey, from the Ottoman Empire. So there are records of the settlement of Turks in the country. Even if you read Robert Percival's account, this was in the early 19th century, 1805, he writes that there were Turks in Ceylon. There were Turks, even John Ferguson has mentioned about the presence of Turks in the country during the British colonial era, a specific community called the Turks. Turks who had in fact come from different parts of the world, from the Ottoman Empire and India, those who were of Turkish descent who had settled in the country during the British colonial period. And even if you read Edward Denham's account, he makes mention of the Turks who had in fact settled during the British colonial period. And there was a community called Dakini Muslims during the British colonial period.
Right.
Dakini Muslims are those who came from South India. Dakini Muslims are those who hailed from South India. So Dakini in the sense, they're from the south. Okay, so they were from Karnataka, from Madras, from Hyderabad, from those areas. And these places also had this Turkish influence, Turkish sultanates and all those. So these Dakini Muslims spoke their own language called Dakini. There were several Dakini Muslims in our country, right? So these Dakini Muslims settled in different parts of the island. They were traders, they were merchants, they were attached to government service. There were even laborers who were brought from India by the British. Now Dakini Muslims in the sense, it could either mean that those people are South Indians who had converted from Hinduism to Islam, and it could also mean that these Dakini Muslims, some of them, some of the families, in fact had Pathan, Turkish and Persian ancestry and all those. So some of those Dakini Muslims, not some but a significant population, settled in Ceylon during the British colonial period, mainly in the coastal areas as well, right? And they spoke a language called Dakini, which had a lot of Turkish words, right? So we had many Dakini Muslims who settled in Ceylon, and they were mistakenly identified as Bengalis. So the Ceylonese mistakenly identified anyone who hailed from India as Bengalis, whether it be the Pathans or the Bohras or the Maimans or the Khojas or even the Dakini Muslims, who were often the misnomer. Bengali was used to identify the Dakini Muslims, but Dakini Muslims are originally people who came from Hyderabad, Madras, Mysore, from Karnataka, from the Deccan Plateau, from the southern parts of India. They could either be descendants of the Turks, the Afghans, Pathans, Persians who settled in South India, if not the Hindus who had converted from is the Hinduism to Islam, or from other religions to Islam, and they settled in different parts of the island. So during the British colonial period, there was a very clear distinction between the Ceylon Moors and the Indian Moors. So Indian Moors are predominantly those who were hailed from South India, some of whom claim Turkish descent as well, because there are stories about the fact that there were Arab settlers who had settled in Malabar and Coromandel Coast and all those areas, and they married the native women, and their descendants were identified as Marpillars. And those Marpillars settled in our country as well. Now, when you talk about the evidence, there isn't much of archaeological evidence or in terms of historical evidences to prove whether or not certain families have Arab descent or whether they have Berber descent. In Sri Lanka, they use the term Moor to identify the Muslims of our country. But Moor is actually a term which was used by the Spaniards and the Portuguese to identify the Muslims who lived in northern Africa as well as in Europe. So that was the reason why they used the term. So when the Portuguese came to our country, they found Muslims living in Ceylon. So when they found Muslims living in Ceylon, they employed the term Moor. But Moor was originally used to identify those who were living in Maghreb. Maghreb in the sense countries like Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Algeria, as well as Sicily and various European countries, and those who lived in the Iberian Peninsula. And those Muslims were identified as Moors. But when the Portuguese conquistadors came to Ceylon, they found a Muslim community in our country and identified them as Moors. Do you know that even in Philippines, Muslims are identified as Moors? Likewise, even in Bangladesh, the Muslims are identified as Moors. So this misnomer Moor came into existence. Now it's been used to identify a specific community. But it does not mean that the ancestors of the community hailed from northern Africa, from the Berber settlement, because Moors was used as a term to identify the Berbers. But there is somewhat of evidence to prove that there are certain families who are of Arabian descent as well as Turkish origin, right? Because of the fact that there were Turkish traders who came to our country from time to time. And in fact, even if you read the book that is History of Ceylon Police and the history of the Ceylon Muslim, there was a riot that was in 1915, and a book authored by A.C. Depp. He even mentions the names of the Turks who were living in the country, who were apprehended in 1915, that period when the First World War broke out. The Ottomans were against the British. Right. So there are like mention of families like the Effendi family, for example, Mohammed Effendi, again Mohammed Hassen Effendi, likewise people who were belonging to the El Daka family, Shafi El Daka, Sohail El Daka, Mohammed El Daka. Likewise, there were also people who came to Ceylon to sell Turkish caps from Turkey. I'll be talking about it's the Turkish fez. So even those Turks, the Turk traders, as well as the Turk families that had settled in Ceylon, some of them were in fact apprehended during this period, 1914 up until 1918, when First World War broke out.
Talk us through the contributions of this community throughout the years.
Okay, so because of the fact that we maintain strong trade ties, we exported various commodities from Ceylon to Turkey, like I mentioned, to Jeddah, to Mecca, to various other places, even to Constantinople, which is now called as Istanbul, the headquarters of the whole Ottoman Empire. So from Ottoman Empire as well, we did import various goods. There are records of, as I mentioned, there were carpets obviously being sent from the Ottoman Empire to India, and then from India we had various products of Turkish manufacture that were then imported to Ceylon. This is starting from the Portuguese colonial period. Even during the Dutch colonial era, there were many Turkish traders who had lived in different parts of the country. And I guess the most significant contribution when it comes to the Turks, and talking about the Muslims in our country, is obviously the Turkish cap, the Turkish fez.
The fez.
And the fez, the Muslims identify it as Turku Toppi. Toppi is Tamil for cap, Turki is for the Turks, right? So the Turkish cap was introduced to the country, and the history of the Turkish cap, because the name says Turkish, it was in fact the Sultan of Turkey called Mahmud II. So this was in the 19th century, and that was when he wanted this cap to be popularized across the world. The reason is, back then, whether it be in most of these Arabian countries as well as in different parts of the world, people used to wear turbans. And turbans used to signify rank, social status, hierarchy, their family background and everything, depending on the style, depending on the pattern, depending on the colors and everything. So this particular Sultan, Sultan Mahmud II, wanted to get rid of this sumptuary laws, wanted to get rid of this whole, he was a very radical egalitarian. So he wanted to get rid of this separation, social stratification based on this rank and the family background and all those. So he wanted to make this fez as a symbol of the entire Muslim community, so that Muslims across the world will start wearing the fez. Fez gets its name from the Moroccan city called Fez, and they used crimson berries to color these fez back then to get this typical maroon color. So during 1870s, now in Egypt, there were many who revolted against the British and the French. So from Egypt, there was this very prominent Egypt nationalist leader who was part of this mutiny. He was arrested and later exiled to the far-flung colony of Ceylon, and the man who came to our country during the 1882 was Orabi Pasha. So Orabi Pasha, who was a prominent figure, a nationalist hero, revered, hero-worshipped across the world, he came with his friends, 7 political exiles, their families and retinues, came to Ceylon in 1882. And his entourage, his companions and some of his Turkish servants wore the Turkish fez. So because they started wearing the Turkish fez, it was later popularized across the island. So the story is that the reason why the Moors also started wearing the Turkish fez is, prior to the advent of Orabi Pasha, the Moors in Ceylon did not wear the Turkish fez. They had their own headgear, and it was called the Surati Toppi. Right, so this has been mentioned by J.C. Willis, Arthur Thompson, Henry Cave, Allen and various other, John Capper. Many others have described the cap that the Moors wore prior to the advent of the Turkish cap. So what the Moors used to do is shave their heads, and they used to wear a brimless hat, beehive, infantine beehive shaped or a thimble shape or an inverted pot shaped cap called Surati Toppi. It has also been mentioned in Mark and Marikar's account, which was wrapped in silk. And this particular headgear was worn by the Moors prior to the arrival of Orabi Pasha. Now, Orabi Pasha came from Egypt. Egypt had been influenced heavily by the Turks, and he used to wear the Turkish fez. So then the Muslims in our country wanted to kind of wear the Turkish fez as well. And what happened was, there was this Muslim lawyer called Abdul Qadir, MC Abdul Qadir, who was prevented from stepping into the court because he refused to wear the horsehair wig. So he wanted to wear the Turkish fez, and then there was a fez committee that was appointed, and there was a protest that took place on the 31st of December 1905 at the Maradana Mosque. Right, there were 30,000 people who congregated to protest against the British so that the Moors could wear the fez. So out of the 30,000, 20,000 people were Moors, while the remaining 10,000, there is a mention of Turks who were living in the country. The remaining 10,000 included Malays and Afghans and Persians and various other Muslim communities, and also the Sikhs, because the Sikhs also wear a turban, right? So those who wear headgears all wanted to protest against the British because of the best opportunity. And then there is also mention in the Times of Ceylon, published on the 1st of January 1906, that there were Turks who also protested against the British, and then the Moors of our country were allowed to wear the Turkish fez, and now it has become an identity of the Ceylonese Moor community.
Thank you very much, Zameer, for that interesting account on how the fez cap came into existence in Sri Lanka. We'll be back with another interesting segment coming your way next Friday at 9:30 p.m. Do stay with us.